Hey everybody, please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, share, and leave your comments below. Okay, Christopher Peaks back here today with Brandon Mosley and our weekly BCS, state of Alabama, and gonna have I guess we both decided that as much as everybody loved enjoying hearing, what me and Brandon had to say about things, that we should probably get somebody in here who was more in the know. So we're gonna have our first guest today.
We need somebody who knows what they're doing.
Yeah, have our first guest today. Somebody I've developed a friendship with over the last year. Former Congressman from North Alabama, the Honorable Mo Brooks. Mo, how are you today, sir?
I'm doing well. How about y'all?
I'm great. Brandon, how are you?
Yeah, I'm doing really good here. Just survived the 3 days of the Alabama legislature.
Hey, so Congressman, I want to ask you. Now this race, I'm sorry, it was your first one, but that was the only one I didn't vote for you in. It was in 2006 when you was running for lieutenant governor against Luther Strange and George Wallace Jr.
Well, my first race was 1982.
Oh, sorry, I meant statewide race.
Yeah.
So, what was what happened in that race? Because I remember Wallace had a big lead, and then it's like Strange came out of there, and then you was pushing a good show. And how did Wallace lose that?
Well, George Wallace had a lot of name recognition, but he didn't have the monetary support of the special interests. Luther Strange was and is a professional lobbyist, and the special interests love to put in positions of power one of their own. Katie Britt would be an excellent example of that in the U.S. Senate race. She got millions upon millions of dollars backing her up for the U.S. Senate. Luther Strange got millions upon millions of dollars backing him up for that lieutenant governor's race back in 2006. And there's a reason why people say money is the mother's milk of politics. With that money, you can put forth an image of yourself as a candidate. May or may not be true, may have nothing to do with what you actually stand for or believe in, but the public votes on images, not necessarily reality. Additionally, that kind of money can do what Richard Shelby advised me of long ago when I first got to Congress, when he was telling me to raise a whole bunch of cash. You can also portray your opponent to be anything you want that opponent to be, including someone the candidate's own mother wouldn't vote for. And so money plays a huge role in these campaigns. Special interests are highly motivated to provide the money if the candidate will agree to the quid pro quo, giving the special interests what they want. And so that's what happened in 2006, and it's happened in many races. I don't want to pick on Luther Strange. He's just one in a long, long line of candidates that the special interests have rallied behind because they curry special favors that are in conflict with the public interest. And the only way they're going to get those special favors is by buying them with campaign contributions, usually, sometimes with illegal contributions. We just had a New Jersey senator who had a bunch of gold bars lying around. We've got another Democrat congressman from Texas who's also accused of influence peddling to the tune of about $600,000. And so money corrupts.
One thing that really impressed me about you in that race is you said something in an interview about you didn't have the back, you had a cell phone, you had a pickup truck, and you were going around to the voters. Shifting gears, Congressman, I'll let Brandon come here and ask you a question next. Let's talk about the big event right here. Was the meeting with Putin, President Trump and Zelensky, Vance, was that a success or failure, or how should we rate it?
Well, if you're Putin, it was an outstanding success. If you're supporting Russia and its aggression, or North Korea and its aggression, keeping in mind that North Korea is also using troops now against the Ukraine forces, or China, who wants to invade Taiwan. All of these things are great successes for them. And this, what I refer to as the White House media debacle, was a horrific loss for Ukraine President Zelensky, for the Ukrainian people, for Donald Trump, and for the people of America. Anyone associated with the actual event, it was a debacle, so they lost.
Congressman, the president seems to be putting pressure on Zelensky to accept a deal with Putin by cutting off military assistance to Ukraine. Is there a danger? I know the president wants to end this war, but is there a danger that by putting pressure on Zelensky and cutting off those American weapons, which have been such a force multiplier for Ukraine, if they don't have American weapons going forward, that could tilt the balance? Is there a danger that could tilt the balance of power on the battlefield so much in favor of Russia that they don't agree to a deal because they're getting what they want on the ground by conquest?
Look, President Trump is absolutely wrong to help the North Koreans and Russia with their attacks on Ukrainian forces. Absolutely wrong. And this originates out of spite or revenge, in my opinion, dating back to 2019. In 2019, Donald Trump was president, and he demanded that Zelensky and Ukraine publicly announce an investigation of Joe Biden. In my judgment, Donald Trump made that demand in order to help him beat Joe Biden in the 2020 elections. Zelensky responded, I don't want to get involved in America's domestic politics. That would not be a good thing for Ukraine. It's a very perilous course of action you asked me to take, and so I'm going to respectfully decline. And in retaliation, Donald Trump immediately suspended all aid to Ukraine. And that suspension lasted for a considerable period of time. And you're seeing Donald Trump this go around use the same kind of measures. And it's not just the cessation of delivery of military armaments, it's also denying Ukraine the relatively inexpensive intelligence that we have been able to provide Ukraine so that Ukraine is better prepared for Russia's next attacks within Ukrainian territory. And the reason I say this is all wrong, it's multifaceted. First, the president is asking Ukraine and Zelensky to surrender, okay? It's not about peace. That's just the political lingo, the propaganda that is used to try to make it look better, what Donald Trump is trying to do. He is demanding a partial or complete surrender of Ukraine to Russia. Partial is immediate, giving up land and rewarding Russia for their invasion of Ukraine. And that demand by President Trump and coercion by President Trump is wrong. It's also wrong because it is a betrayal of a country that has been an ally for 3 years now, longer for that matter. And every other American ally around the globe sees how unreliable the word of the United States of America is, and that diminishes our standing in the world, free world opinion. It also suggests to our allies that perhaps when America is attacked, they should not rush to the aid of America, because this betrayal of Ukraine signals to our allies that we are not reliable and we're not going to rush to their aid if they get attacked. And so if they walk away with an impression that the United States is not reliable, that the United States will not honor its agreements with its allies, then that encourages our allies to treat the United States the same. So it's really bad for our image. It's really bad for our alliances. It is a betrayal, not just in the sense that we've been working with Ukraine for a number of years, but I'm going to digress decades. Back in 1994, there was an agreement. It was signed by Russia. It was signed by Ukraine. It was signed by the United Kingdom, and it was signed by the United States of America. And it helped to establish not only the boundaries between Russia and Ukraine, it also caused Ukraine to give up its best national security weapon, nuclear weapons. Now, the United States rushed in and threw, as we always do, money at the problem. And the pressure from the United States, coupled with the inducement of the money, caused Ukraine to give up its best border security weapon, those nuclear weapons, to transfer them to Ukraine. And Ukraine did so with the understanding that the United States, Russia, and the United Kingdom would respect the boundaries that Russia and Ukraine agreed on. Well, the United States has breached that agreement because we did nothing when this invasion began in 2014. We did a little bit in 2018 and 2019 under Trump. Of course, Trump got mad at Zelensky and Ukraine and suspended aid for some period of time. My memory serves me correctly, it's for 55 days. And then when you had yet another invasion, keep in mind, first it was Crimea, then it was two eastern regions of Ukraine, and then 3 years ago, it was the whole country. So all of this is really bad public policy. There is not an instance in history, world history, that I'm aware of, where appeasement to an aggressor nation has caused that aggressor nation to quit being aggressive. But history is replete with examples of where appeasement results in larger wars. Probably the most notable one, most memorable one, being Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, appeasing Nazi Germany not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 or 5 times before the United Kingdom and also France decided that they had to do something to stop Nazi Germany. Otherwise, Nazi Germany was going to overrun Europe and oppose their dictatorial will and everybody else. And unfortunately for the United Kingdom and France, they waited too late. And Nazi Germany was able to overrun mainland Europe. And fortunately for the United Kingdom, with the help of the United States, Nazi Germany was not able to overrun the United Kingdom too.
Is the president allowing our foreign policy to be dictated by our short-term economic policy, i.e., getting the war over with so that we can lift the sanctions on Russia so that they can start, back to exporting their oil, and we can start importing their fertilizer components, which our farmers desperately need?
Well, economics is almost always a factor in every war that's been fought, okay? There are winners and losers economically from these kinds of conflicts, both on a national level and on a corporate level, or on an oligarch level, a wealthy person level, someone who manufactures armaments by way of examples. So this is not unusual that economics would be a factor, but we need to understand some basic concepts here. We are a free world country. We have other countries around the world that also believe in freedom and are republics. And we tend to form alliances with fellow republics because of the threat of dictatorial governments around the globe. Now, we can call them communists, we can call them a bunch of different things, but they are a threat to freedom and liberty. They're a threat to democracy and our Republican form of government. And we don't want these dictatorial nations such as Iran, such as Communist China, such as North Korea, such as Russia, to be able to spread their dictatorial value system, their brutality on the free world. And unfortunately, what has happened is Donald Trump has forgotten these principles. And Donald Trump is now aiding and abetting a very evil dictator, Putin, in his conquest of Russia. And since North Korea has sent troops into the battlefield in support of Russia, fighting and killing Ukrainians, Donald Trump is also supporting the North Korean effort. And that's got to be troublesome to anyone in America who believes in liberty, who believes in freedom, who believes in democracies and our Republican form of government. It's certainly concerning to me. And the long-term message is this: if we continue to betray Ukraine, as Donald Trump is betraying Ukraine, if we continue to betray our allies in Europe, then that is a sign of weakness to Russia, to North Korea, to Communist China, and it is an encouragement to each of them to be aggressive while you've got a weak president holding office in America's White House. That's the message. That's the way they're going to interpret it. If we surrender, or we encourage Ukraine to surrender in whole or in part, and that's exactly what Donald Trump is doing. It's bad policy.
If we retreat into an American first, it's us for us, we're not worried about the rest of the world, foreign policy, should Germany, Japan, Saudi Arabia, maybe Poland, should they begin building nuclear weapons so they have their own deterrent if they can't rely on the United States?
Well, if I were them, yes, because I would want nuclear weapons so that the mutually assured destruction doctrine protects each and every one of them from invasion. For those who are listening to this show or watching this show, the mutually assured destruction doctrine is real simple. You dare not attack me, because if you do, I will unleash my nuclear arsenal on you, and it will be mutual suicide. Assuming you don't want to die, you won't attack me. And the mutually assured destruction doctrine has worked ever since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Russia's obtaining nuclear weapons later in the 1940s. And I would expect that there would be a widespread proliferation of nuclear weapons. And quite frankly, looking back on it, it was a major mistake in 1994 for Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons and rely on the word of Russia not to attack, and rely on the United Kingdom and the United States to help Ukraine respect the borders that were agreed to in this document and in other documents.
Congressman, with this war being so brutal since we've seen since the Eastern Front of World War II, Ukraine seems to be running out of men. Where do they replenish this manpower at?
Well, actually, they're not running out of men. They've had, if you believe the Ukrainian government, and I would take their word with a grain of salt, but they've had 45,000 deaths as of earlier this year in a nation that is tens of millions of people. They might be running out of volunteers. They might have to go to a draft, but you know, that's not unusual. The United States has had to do a draft for Vietnam, for Korea, for World War II, for World War I, for the Civil War. So that's not unusual. In terms of casualty rates, the Russians are suffering much higher casualties than the Ukrainians, to the point where Russia has run out of prisoners to send to get killed and slaughtered on the front lines, and has had to rely on an ally, North Korea, to supplement its military forces. To me, we hate to see these casualties, don't get me wrong, but Ukraine has the manpower. The only issue is whether the free world is going to stop Russia here by supplying the kind of weaponry that overwhelms the Russian forces. And we have that capability. Even though Ukraine might have fewer soldiers on the battlefield, their kill capability will vastly exceed that of Russian forces if we share with Ukraine the weaponry that is needed. But if we don't do that, then you might see American forces having to defend in the Balkans, the Baltics, Poland, Sweden, Finland, or Norway, whatever the next target of Russia may be. And that's assuming that China doesn't see this as a great opportunity to finally attack Taiwan.
Marksman, with our budget now, I think 1.5% of it going to pay for this war is, and as much as we are in debt, is that going to start putting a strain on us?
Well, 1.5% is 1.5%, and every little bit helps. But to put it into perspective, our deficit is about 1.8, $1.9 trillion. Last year's approximately 1.8. This year it's projected to be 1.9 to 2 trillion. But we're 5 months into it, 7 months to go. You've got Doge out there trying to cut spending. So hopefully we'll be better off than Biden's last fiscal year. But the amount of money we're spending to assist a fellow republic is less than 5% of the annual deficits that we're racking up, or roughly 5%. It might be a little bit more, a little bit less, somewhere in that ballpark. So while 5% of the overall deficit is still significant at 5%, it's not going to make a difference in whether we go belly up as a country because of the accumulated debt that's now $36 trillion. Also bear in mind that we're spending roughly $1 trillion on servicing our debt, which is more than triple what we were spending just a short 3 or 4 years ago. So you have to bear in mind the debt, and you have to look at it long term. If Russia defeats Ukraine, if President Trump is successful in forcing Ukraine to surrender in whole or in part, is there going to be a bigger war in our future? That's what you have to look at. We don't like the costs that we're incurring, but will there be a larger cost if we don't incur these costs now? And will those larger costs in the future also include a loss of American lives on the battlefield, which is a major risk? You know, we were drawn into World War II. We were drawn into World War I. In a way, we were drawn into Korea and Vietnam, not as significantly as World War I and as obviously as World War I and World War II, but still, there are cascading effects. And the historical lesson ought to be that if you can nip these things in the bud, stop the aggressor early on, when they have less manpower and they have less resources, then in the long haul, you're saving yourself a lot of money and you're saving a lot of American lives.
We've talked about, there possibly being a peace dividend of us not having to pay for Ukraine's aid if this war ends. How much of that would be negated? Because if, we see basically, 20% of Ukraine to Russia permanently in a peace deal, that would allow Putin, who has militarized his economy, much like Germany did in World War II, he can redeploy his forces, against the Baltic states or against Poland. So even if there's no war, we may have to go to a Cold War footing like we were in the 60s, 70s, 80s, where there were, U.S. forces deployed in Europe permanently at, multiple division strength, afraid that Putin will cross the border because, he's invaded Ukraine twice and he's had other military adventures. While he's in power, there's no reason to believe that when this war is over, that Putin's wars are over.
Well, you're spot on with that analysis. And let me emphasize something, and this is also in accord with what happened with Nazi Germany in the 1930s and up until the period of time in which the United States became involved with the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Each time an aggressor nation conquers surrounding land, they have more natural resources for their war machine, and they have a pool of conscripts that they can make fight in their wars against other nations. So what happens is the threat becomes greater because the threat becomes more powerful. With Nazi Germany, you had them taking over Austria. All of a sudden, boy, that's a whole lot of manpower they have at their disposal, a lot of resources. You have them taking over Czechoslovakia. That's, again, a bunch of resources and a bunch of people. And if Russia acquires all or part of Ukraine, what they're next going to do is, in my judgment at least, is test the will of the free world by picking off some of the Balkan or Baltic nations that are relatively small. And each time they gobble up another piece, they have strengthened themselves for the next fight. And ultimately, it becomes much, much more costly monetarily and with the loss of life to stop the aggression. So that's what I mean when I say you got to nip it in the bud. Right now, you've got Ukrainians who are dying, not Americans. Ukrainians are dying in the name of liberty and freedom and independence for their nation. All they are asking for is for the free world to help supply them with the weaponry so that they can make Russia pay and bleed them dry and ultimately force Russia out of Ukraine. In my judgment, if the free world would adequately arm Ukraine, they would beat Russia hands down. One thing that this Ukraine war has shown is that Russia does not have the kind of military capability that they once had. Their weaponry is not on a par with that of the United States of America. Russia, by way of example, has relied heavily on tanks. Well, nowadays, tanks basically are a place where you go if you want to get exploded, because the tanks are taken out pretty quickly with the modern day weaponry that we have, the anti-tank weapons such as Javelin, just being one example, that is very, very effective at turning each of those tanks into very hot coffins for 4, 5, 6 Russian soldiers that are within. So it's just a matter of us supplying the weaponry along with the free world. Now, I will mention there is one really good thing about Donald Trump betraying our ally Ukraine, and to a lesser degree, betraying our NATO partners. It has scared our NATO partners to death, and they are being forced to carry more of the load for the defense of Europe. That might have been an intended goal by President Trump or an unintended goal of President Trump. Regardless, it's one of the things that is happening. And to the extent Western Europe becomes more militarily strong or stronger, then they make better allies for the United States of America. And collectively, all of us become a more potent weapon because of the growth and strength emanating from Europe.
So, Congressman, do you think with the proper military aid, they could push them Russia back?
Oh, absolutely. Our weaponry is so vastly superior to what the Russians and the Iranians and the North Koreans are able to field. No question. If we were all in, Russia would get pummeled and they would be forced all the way back to their original borders. And that would be a very strong lesson to the aggressors around the world that you better not mess with us, because if you do, you're going to lose. And ultimately, the long-term goal ought to be the removal of Putin as the dictator in charge of Russia. And if Russia were to lose in Ukraine, then there is an increasing chance that the Russian people would take back control of their government and evict Putin as their leader using whatever means are at their disposal.
Changing topics, Congressman. When you were in the Congress, you were like the leading anti-illegal immigration, border security hawk, pretty much in the Congress while you were there. Are you liking what we're seeing from the Trump administration on reversing some of some of the chaos we were getting from Biden, where they were importing people by the millions? Or do we need to do a lot more?
Well, there are a lot of different parts to that. When you've got an illegal immigrant problem or illegal alien problem, to me, that's a better descriptive term. There are two sides to the coin. One side of the coin is how many illegal aliens illegally cross our border and do their damage in America. The other side of the coin is how many illegal aliens who are already here do you deport? And I like the success that we've had under Donald Trump in reducing the number of illegal aliens that are crossing the border into America. That's a big plus. And that helps solve the overall problem. Unfortunately, the deportation of illegal aliens, although highly publicized, is woefully inadequate to solve the problem. To give you an idea of how big the problem is, and it's enormous, and people need to understand it's enormous. If you were to cut border crossings that are illegal into America to zero, okay, you would have to deport over 100,000 illegal aliens every month in order to eliminate the illegal alien problem in America in a period of years beyond the Trump administration, i.e. more than 4 years, okay? So when you read about Donald Trump deporting maybe 3,000 or 5,000 or 10,000, and unfortunately there's conflicting information on the deportation side of it, how much of it has been successful. That is woefully inadequate if you're going to solve the problem. Now, in fairness to Donald Trump, he's only been in office for what, a month and a half? So he's at the beginning of the deportation effort, but he's got to really ramp it up if he's going to have a significant effect on the illegal problem that already exists. It's in excess of 20 million illegal aliens in America, in my judgment. Although, in fairness, nobody really knows because the federal government doesn't have accurate data. Nobody has accurate data. So everything is, in effect, an estimate.
Keeping on that topic for a moment, is there a danger, we're a long way from there, but of deporting too many so that then our business and industry starts to lack the labor? If you've been down here in Montgomery, you can see we're building a new state house behind the old state house. And I mean, I don't know the legal status of the people building the state house, but they seem to be overwhelmingly Latino and Hispanic. If we were to lose even 10% of that labor, does it all of a sudden create a tremendous problem with American manufacturers and builders being able to get, and farmers being able to get their work done from lack of, but by losing that labor source?
Well, that's certainly the way special interests that profit from illegal aliens want to portray it. I consider it a boon because what happens? Now to get the work done, you have to hire Americans. Gosh, think of the numbers of people we might get off the welfare rolls. Wouldn't that be wonderful? In addition, in order to attract American workers to do those jobs, you'd have to increase their pay. These are people getting all sorts of benefits, whether it's food stamps or subsidies here or subsidies there, like with healthcare, college education, or what have you. And wouldn't it be wonderful if all of a sudden they're self-sufficient? Back in the 1950s and 1960s, and I was alive then, people who worked with their hands, they could make a good living, but they can't anymore because the wages have been so badly suppressed by the huge artificial influx of illegal alien labor on the one hand and cheap legal foreign labor on the other hand, thereby depriving large segments of American society of the American dream. So yeah, would there be a short-term disruption? Yeah, there would be. But I believe in capitalism. I believe in free enterprise. And I believe that you ought to let the market take care of it. And you're going to be forcing the employers to compete for the labor that they want to get the jobs done, which is going to result in higher wages for Americans. And I would submit that as a good thing, not a bad thing.
Congressman, another subject you mentioned a while ago, Doge. What's your take on that so far? Is this going to be a good thing, bad thing?
Well, I've got a number of different reactions to Doge. First, in principle, it's a good idea. Okay. Second, I don't know what numbers to believe. I'm quite confident that the successes that Doge claims are in total false. I don't believe that they have saved American taxpayers over $100 billion, which was the number they had on their website yesterday. And that's in large part because the other side now is fighting back. You've got court orders, you've got administrative orders, you've got all sorts of things that are coming into play now that are stopping some of the claimed Doge successes. But given that we've got a $1.8 trillion deficit from last fiscal year, given that we're headed for a national insolvency and bankruptcy, anything Doge can do to not only reduce waste and fraud, but just cut down on otherwise legitimate but lesser priority federal government spending is a good thing, and that's a success, okay? But again, putting it into perspective, $1.8 trillion deficit, assuming for the moment that Doge is correct on their website with $108 billion in savings, and I don't know over what period of time that is, how many years that is, but let's assume it's all in FY 2025. That's a good thing, but it's still a small drop in a big bucket. That just gives you an idea of the magnitude of the financial crisis that the United States of America is barreling towards. And we got to do some really radical things to prevent, unless you want to usher in the worst period in American history, with the possible exception of the Civil War.
Is there a danger with the Doge cuts? Because the Doge is set up by the executive branch, though, even though that's a good thing in theory, a strict constructionist reading of the Constitution might show that it's the Congress who is supposed to set the spending priorities of the federal government and not an executive branch agency. Could a court ultimately find that the Doge is acting unconstitutionally, as if Congress has set this budget number at whatever it is, the Doge doesn't necessarily have constitutional authority to change that number?
Well, certainly that is the argument that the courts are going to have to resolve. I hope the courts will rule appropriately, but I'm going to break all this down into two parts. One part consists of money that we have in revenue that is being spent. You've got a very good argument that the executive branch has to spend that money in accord with the dictates of the United States Congress. However, that $1.8 trillion part, that is the deficit, that is 27% of total spending. I don't believe that the executive branch of the government has any duty to spend money that Congress wishes to spend, but hasn't given to the executive branch to spend. It's one thing to dictate the spending of money. It's another thing to provide the money that you're dictating being spent. And so I would submit that the president has the ability to stop any spending under the United States Constitution for which Congress has not actually provided the revenue to fund.
Congressman, let me move to another subject right here. It took, since the beginning of time up until a few years ago, we didn't know the difference between a man and a woman, when a 5-year-old kid does.
You and I did. Just the crazy lefties did it. The science deniers, the biology 101 flunkers.
Yes. I mean, so is that behind this? Is this wokeness behind us now? Yeah. Is this wokeness behind us now? Or no. Is it going to?
It is a battle, a culture war that's going to last indefinitely until the science deniers figure out that science is science and biology is biology. And there are differences between men and women that are fairly apparent. And that resolves the dispute. The science deniers haven't been able to figure that out.
Are we going to lose that eventually? Because I mean, I just
that's to be determined by the American people. You know, I hope that the American people will never get dumb enough where they don't understand the difference between men and women. But the American people did put Joe Biden in as president, and they did give Nancy Pelosi the gavel as House Speaker, and they did make Chuck Schumer the presiding officer, the president of the Senate. And so I have some real concerns about the lack of intelligence of large numbers of American voters who did that to the United States of America. And I can, you know, there's some other factors too, like greed. That's a factor. But gosh, so much of it is just stupidity on the part of American voters. But I'd add one caveat. These elections are a comparison. And the Republicans need to do a whole lot better job of offering better candidates and better ideas so that the ideas that we offer are superior to some of the dumb ones that the public has ratified that the socialists, communists, and Democrats believe in.
Congressman, what happened? I know we talked about this one time too. You mentioned something about a moderate type, you know, for Bill Clinton type candidate. What happened to the Democrats? Because when I grew up, I remember people like Lloyd Benson, and they were nothing like this today. Yeah, Sam Nunn. I mean, even
Hal Heflin.
I remember my father holding me up to vote for Wallace when I was a kid. I mean, but these guys have went so out of touch today. What happened to the Democratic Party?
Well, the Democratic Party does not like any of the individuals that you just mentioned, and pretty much made it untenable for them to win in a present-day Democratic primary. And I'm going to focus on Shelby for just a moment. For those in the audience who don't know, Shelby was a Democrat for most of his life. And he didn't switch parties because he liked the values of Republicans. He switched parties in order to gain power in the United States Senate, and because he was smart enough to foresee that the state of Alabama was becoming more receptive to Republicans, and if Shelby stayed a Democrat, he would eventually lose. And he brought his values with him as a Democrat to the Republican Party. And probably the one that is the most distasteful is he was a debt junkie. He was a huge spender. And in my opinion, you can make a pretty compelling argument that Richard Shelby is more responsible for our $36 trillion debt, our $1.8 trillion deficit, our $1 trillion a year, roughly speaking, in debt service costs than any other individual in the history of the United States of America, bearing in mind when he was first elected to the United States Congress back around 1976 or 78, somewhere in that ballpark in the late 1970s. Our total debt was less than $1 trillion, if my memory serves me correctly. And so under Shelby's stewardship, it multiplied by a factor of 30. And then also bear in mind that Richard Shelby, for a significant part of his career, was on the Appropriations Committee, which is the debt junkie committee that thrives on spending money that America does not have, has to borrow to get, and cannot afford to pay back.
Congressman, we're getting 500 and probably eventually another 1,000 FBI agents sent to Huntsville, which is good for Huntsville. But there's a total of 30,000 employees for the FBI. Essentially, the FBI could redeploy its force and basically have one agent per every 10,000 Americans overseeing what they do and the local law enforcement that's there. Have we grown that agency beyond what is rational or even necessary to function as a country?
That is a good question for which I do not have a firm answer for. By and large, I believe in backing our law enforcement community. I believe in stronger penalties for criminals. I believe that those stronger penalties will deter future criminal conduct. And we've got a lot of crime that the FBI has not been able to slow down or stop. Although that's also true of every law enforcement agency in the United States of America. And so if I'm going to err, I would tend to err on making sure the FBI has more resources with which to fight crime, not fewer resources with which to fight crime. But having said all that, a very big problem with the FBI is getting them to focus on what you and I call the major criminal threats and less on the politicization of various things that one political party or another political party wants the FBI to spend resources on.
In another issue, we've got the farm bill that's being negotiated now. You've been in those farm bill debates, their support for farmers and they have their lobby. And then there's, the supplemental nutritional assistance people and their lobby. Do we need to for fiscal reasons, be a little less generous with our, you come to this country illegally or legally, and then you get supplemental nutritional assistance, or even you've been born here and it seems like you always have a car. I mean, we want people to be able to eat, but I don't know that we can continue to feed everybody off of deficit spending, which is essentially what we're doing at the moment. How do we reform that without causing like a food crisis?
Well, you've got many paradoxical problems with the Farm Bill. And what the public has to do is elect more congressmen, senators who will do the right thing with respect to the Farm Bill. But as you noted, big ag, farm bureaus around the country, in Alabama, Alpha, they're extremely political powerhouses. And they are extraordinarily successful at using the government to forcibly take money from taxpayers to give to the wealthiest of our agricultural community. Now, don't get me wrong, there are also farmers who are in difficult straits through no fault of their own. And you can see that kind of safety net there to ensure that you get the food production or clothing material production from the farming community that you desire, okay? But to make sure everybody understands how big this is, on the subsidy side, Big Ag has been able to siphon out of taxpayers' pockets over $20 billion per year to help ensure that some of the wealthiest people in America become more wealthy. Now, there are different kinds of farmers. Some farmers have huge amounts of acreage and they're well off financially, lots of cash, and of course, tremendous wealth from the value of the real estate. Then you've got some farmers who have a lot of land, but they're cash poor, and they're just barely holding their own. Then you've got some farmers who have minimal land, and they're cash poor. So you got to figure out the best approach to handle all these different circumstances. But Big Ag, to a very large degree, they're the ones who run Alpha. They're the ones who run Farm Bureau. They're the ones who run the special interest lobbyists on behalf of Big Ag. And so it's the wealthiest of the wealthy farmers who tend to come out the best with the farm bills that are passed and the taking of that $20+ billion from taxpayers to give to these corporations and individual farmers who are already among the wealthiest people in the United States of America. That's troublesome. Then another paradox is this. On the one hand, the agricultural community is probably the industry that has successfully lobbied more than any other for cheap foreign labor and non-enforcement of our border security laws, i.e., Big Ag is probably the number one source of the demand for illegal aliens that has created the problem that Donald Trump and his administration is now trying to deal with. So they claim that there's a scarcity of labor. And the paradox is this: at the same time, the special interest Big Ag lobbyists are claiming a scarcity of labor, they're taking another $70 billion from working taxpayers to pay other people in the form of what I call food stamps, but that name changes on a regular basis, to pay them not to work, which in turn creates the labor shortage. You know, if these folks had to work to eat, I can guarantee you they would work to eat. But as long as they've got that $70 billion coming in so that they don't have to work to eat, well, gosh, they're not going to work to eat, particularly since we also give them free healthcare and we give them free housing and free a whole bunch of other stuff. So if you want to help fix the claimed labor shortage problem in America, quit paying so many freeloaders not to work. And all this is in the Farm Bill.
Congressman, speaking of taxpayers, is he going to be able to deliver on the promise? If we've seen tax cuts, are we going to be able to give tax cuts to what he said, no tax on tips and no tax on overtime, and said Social Security? And shouldn't Social Security, isn't that a double taxation anyway? Should that not have ever been taxed?
Well, it is in a way, and certainly it's an issue and a problem. And just as an aside, corporate income tax is taxed twice. It's taxed once as income when the corporation earns it. After the corporation pays taxes, the remnant, that which is not spent on expanding the business, on capital improvements, whatnot, is distributed to the shareholders in the form of, say, interest or perhaps capital gains on which they pay
dividends.
So the same money is taxed twice. And that is a problem. Now, this is another one of those paradoxes. On the one hand, President Trump is trying to sell the American people on the huge tax cuts that he wants to give them. Okay. But on the other hand, we have a $1.8 trillion deficit. And on the other hand, Donald Trump is raising tariffs, which are a tax on the American people. It's one of the largest tax increases ever that Donald Trump has imposed in part and seeks to impose more, because the American people pay every single dime of these tariffs. It's almost like a sales tax on certain goods from certain countries that is embedded in the price of the product. So I don't know how Donald Trump's going to handle all this when on the one hand, he's claiming that he wants tax cuts, but on the other hand, he's already implementing massive tax increases. Personally, I think a much, much better policy, aside, throwing the debt issue aside for a moment, but if you're going to have huge tariff tax increases on the American people, then why not offset that dollar for dollar with tax cuts so that these tariffs are tax neutral to the American people? As a conservative, I would think that would be much better, but there's not been one word passing the lips of Donald Trump that says that these tariffs are going to be anything other than a huge tax increase without any kind of offset.
Just a
Changing
few minutes left,
topics
Brandon.
here, just real shortly. Wednesday, Tommy Tuberville spoke with the press, and he told us when we asked about, if he's going to run for governor or not, he said he's talked with his family, and he's praying, on it, and wants to do whatever's best for the people of Alabama. Assuming Tuberville gets in the governor's race, who do you think, you've been a candidate in the past for Senate, who do you think is going to get in that Senate race?
Well, I don't know who's going to get in it, but I'm sure there'll be dozens, if not hundreds of people who will be considering it. And some number of those will get in, but I don't know who's actually going to do it. And as of this moment, no one has declared to my knowledge. I mean, let's face it, it's hypothetical. You got Tommy Tuberville, who may or may not run for governor. I can understand him not wanting to live in Washington, D.C. D.C. is a very, very high crime area. It's a very stressful job. And quite frankly, neither Tommy Tuberville or any of the other Republican senators have been that successful at getting our major problems solved. And to me, our major problems are deficit and debt. We've been going in the wrong way ever since Donald Trump was elected on deficit and debt. Back in, I guess, 2015 was really the pivot year where we Tea Party Republicans had reduced the deficit under Barack Obama from 1.4 trillion down to 439 billion, which was about $1 trillion improvement financially. Still bad at 439 billion, but it's a whole lot better than 1.4 trillion in annual deficits. But every year of the Donald Trump administration, from 2017 to 2021, the deficit got worse than it was the preceding year. And the Republican House members and the Republican senators certainly didn't get anything productive done in making sure that the United States of America is financially responsible. Additionally, I'm using a broad brush here. I don't want to poke a finger just at Tommy Tuberville because it seems to be the rule across the board for our Republican senators and congressmen. But on border security, what has Congress done that has had a positive effect on border security? Well, pretty much nothing. You might have had a little bit of wall built under the first 4 years of the Trump administration, but obviously that didn't solve the problem because the problem got worse, not better. The number of illegal aliens in America increased, did not decrease. And so Tommy Tuberville's got to be frustrated on deficit and debt. He's got to be frustrated on border security. And perhaps the worst frustration is the Republicans did a pretty crappy job during Trump's first administration, as evidenced by having lost the House in 2018, lost the Senate and White House in 2020. If the Republicans had kept their campaign promises on things like border security or balancing the budget or repealing socialized medicine, if we'd kept our promises, things would have been better. Now, in fairness to Tommy Tuberville, he wasn't there in 2018 and in 2020, but I'm just giving an idea of the frustration that a lot of us conservatives have in Washington, D.C., because we see how badly the Republicans have failed at reversing the damage that has been inflicted primarily by Democrats, but also by our fellow Republicans.
So I have one last question, and I don't know if Brandon, he may have one after me. Then I won't keep you longer because I know we said about an hour. So far through this Trump's first 6 weeks, and what would you grade his administration?
Probably a C+ or a B-. Certainly better than Biden. Certainly better than Kamala Harris. But I have two issues that I base almost all of my evaluations on, and you've heard them mentioned many times during this interview. One is deficit and debt. Donald Trump's making some strides on deficit and debt, but they're so small compared to the magnitude of the problem that they're not going to make a difference. And the ultimate outcome is a national insolvency and bankruptcy that, as I mentioned earlier, would do more damage to America than any other period in American history, with the possible exception of the Civil War. And so, yeah, Donald Trump's done some things of a good nature there, but he's also got some bad things he wants to do. Like he wants an unlimited debt ceiling. Holy cow, that's the only leverage we've got to try to impose some kind of degree of financial responsibility on Washington, D.C. And the second issue is border security. Donald Trump has done good on reducing the number of illegal aliens who try to cross into America. But when you're talking about deporting the illegal aliens who are already here, are already doing damage to Americans, either because of criminal conduct or because of taking jobs or because of suppressing of wages, his efforts have been tiny, tiny, tiny compared to the magnitude of the problem. When you're boasting about deporting 3,000 or 5,000 or 10,000, whatever the numbers may be, and in 6 months, a year from now, we'll have a better idea of what the numbers really are, as opposed to the spin we're seeing in the news media right now, okay? But whatever those numbers are, whether it's 3, 5, or 10,000, that's nowhere near the 100,000 plus that you need to be deporting in order to fix the problem within a 5-year period. So C plus, B minus for effort, but the results are on the two issues that I believe are most important to America. He's still sorely lacking.
Thank you so much, Congressman, for taking time to speak with us today. We've gone a little bit over our hour, but it was very informative.
My pleasure. Y'all have a blessed day. And all the folks out there, please do your homework, understand what these candidates really are going to do, as opposed to what they market they're going to do. And if you do that, then I'm sure you'll elect better people to Washington, D.C. than we have been over the past 20 or 30 years.
Thank you. A pleasure as always, Congressman.
Take care. God bless.